Good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Supporting Researcher Impact, Insights into the Publication Process of Nature Journals, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Jill.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. So hi, everyone, and welcome today to our webinar. I'm really pleased to be here and to be talking about supporting researcher impact. So we'll be looking at insights into the publication process of the Nature journals, and quite a lot of different things actually as well as that, but publishing in the Nature portfolio and how that can benefit researchers, funding and policy. So just to get started, I'd like to do some introductions. There we go. Okay. So I'll start introducing myself and then I'll hand over to Stavroula to give a quick introduction as well. So I'm the head of publishing development at Nature Portfolio. And what does that mean on a day-to-day basis? It means that I take care of a subset of the Nature journals and make sure that everything's running smoothly. I'm not an editor, so I'm not involved in that side of things. It's more the publishing side of things, as you might expect. And in particular, I look after some of our new launches. As you know, we do launch new journals each year, and I'm usually responsible for looking after those as well. And I'll hand over to Stavroula to give a quick hello as well. Oh, I think you're muted, Stavroula.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everybody, again. I am the chief editor of Nature Human Behavior, one of the research titles in the Nature portfolio set of journals. I've been with it. I was hired to launch the journal in 2016, but I've been a professional scientific editor since 2008. My background is in science myself, so I was a working scientist before I became a researcher. So I know how scientists think quite well.
Thank you. Okay. So just before I get started, here we go. I just wanted to highlight these resources for you. Normally I'd put these at the end, but I thought it was actually slightly better to do this earlier on, just so I can cover it a little bit more. So there's a Springer Nature librarian portal, and there's a lot of resources on there. We've got the new launches on there, which of course I know quite a lot about, but also just an overview of our journals, the transformative journals. There's a lot of videos on there explaining, for example, what makes a Nature research paper or what makes a review paper and the difference between the two. So there's a lot of very interesting content on there, just to flag that up now. So jumping straight in now. So the core goal at Springer Nature is to advance scientific discovery and by publishing robust and insightful research. We support the development of new areas of knowledge and join together disciplines and make ideas and information accessible around the world. In this presentation, in my part of the presentation today, I'm going to start with an overview of the Nature portfolio, what makes it unique. I'll talk very broadly about editorial and publishing processes, including OA, and what that means for our authors and readers. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about different article types, just in particular pulling out the difference between primary articles and non-primary articles and how they benefit our authors and readers. At that point, I'll hand over to Stavroula, and she will look at some examples from her journal and the impact of those papers. So let's get started. As you might know already, I'm going to go through this really briefly. Nature Portfolio consists of our flagship journal, Nature, of course, which publishes exceptional research. It's really important journal for us, of course, and for everyone. It's trusted and authoritative. And just underneath that, there are the Nature Research journals. So there are around 40 research journals which span the life sciences, physical sciences, applied and health sciences. And they publish original research, so primary research, and also some review content, so some non-primary content. And then we have 23 reviews, Nature Reviews journals under that. So they're quite different because they only publish review content. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a few slides' time. And then last but not least, there's Nature Communications, which is a fully OA journal with high significance. It is multidisciplinary and it covers biological, health, physical, chemical, and earth sciences. Last year it published 7,500 articles in 2022, which is impressive. So coming back to the differences between the research journals in red and the Nature Reviews journals, which we have in blue. So as I mentioned, it's the content, of course. So Nature Research journals publish original research. And this is the bread and butter of the research journals. This is the main thing that they publish. It is submitted by authors directly. It is extremely high quality and it is filtered, enhanced, and published by us. And the editors work, our in-house teams of editors work on this, making sure that it sticks to the highest scientific, ethical, and reporting standards. So I think what's really important just to mention at this point, for both the research journals and the reviews journals, the editorial teams sit in-house. So these are professional editors. Almost all of them have a PhD, but they have very strong scientific backgrounds, certainly. And that's their job to create a pipeline of content and publish the journal each month. So for the Nature Reviews journals, what's slightly different is the content is not original research. So that means, and I'll talk about exactly what that means in a bit, but it's a synthesis or a review of a field, and it's commissioned. It's commissioned by the editorial teams. They have different uses, so original research and review content, which I'm also going to cover a little later on. But hopefully that outlines at a very high level, at least, the differences between the two. Okay. And here are some of the article types that we publish in both RJs, we call them RJs, research journals, and the Nature Reviews. So Nature Reviews also publish things like consensus statements, technical reviews, roadmaps. So they're also slightly different versions of a review that has a different take on whatever it's reporting on the topic that it's reporting on. And for the Nature Research journals, there are slightly different article types depending on the content that's being submitted. So perhaps a letter or brief communication. And I think I mentioned already, they also do publish some reviews, so some non-primary as well. Okay. There are 3 ways to publish in the Nature portfolio. So this applies, on this slide, this applies to Nature itself and the research journals as well, but it does not apply to the Nature Reviews. They only publish review content, and that is all subscription content. So the first option is through author choice here. So number 1, open access. So that means that an author could submit their manuscript to us. And if it's gone through peer review and it's accepted, then they pay an APC. The alternative is through a transformative agreement. So perhaps the institution or the consortia, maybe a national consortia that institution is a part of, maybe has an agreement with Nature and Nature Portfolio that we're able to submit, have accept and publish their manuscript in one of the Nature journals, and that fee is covered for them via the transformative agreement. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. I've simplified it, but those are sort of the 2 ways to get published as an OA article in the Nature journals. One of the things that we've recently brought in is support for authors from low income and low middle income countries. And that was announced in January of this year. And then the third route for publication is, of course, subscription. I say, of course, subscription because They have traditionally for a very long time been subscription journals, and it's only since 2021 that we've been able to offer open access. So subscription is simply submitting your manuscript if it's accepted. It is published, and obviously the author does not pay a fee for that, but the readers do pay a fee to subscribe to the journal and read that. And as I mentioned, that covers all Nature Reviews content. So a little bit about transformative journals. So our research journals are transformative journals. So what that means is effectively they're hybrid journals with a promise to eventually or potentially flip to fully OA at some point in the future. And transformative journals is some of the criteria that was set out by Plan S back in 2019 when it originally came out. And they became transformative journals in 2021. So this image on the slide is a snapshot from the 2021 Transformative Journals report that Springer Nature published in June last year, so in 2022. The objective of the report was to provide an update to all stakeholders, whether that be readers or authors or librarians, on the progress of the transformative journals. How is this OA publishing going for the Nature portfolio? This report gives us all the information from 2021. So that's why I was pointing out the years. So it's from 2021, it was published in 22, and there will be another one this year. And while the report covered all transformative journals at Springer Nature, so not just the Nature TJs, but all Springer Nature TJs, what I can pull out from here is that 24 journals in the Nature portfolio newly on their path to OA met the target set by Plan S, which was to achieve and maintain a TJ status. They also, as a portfolio, grew OA content by 8%, which you see in the bottom red on the image, compared to 2020. Over what I find impressive here, though, as well, is over the entire Springer Nature portfolio, TJ portfolio, we published 40% more gold OA than the previous year. Okay. So moving on to an overview of the publishing processes at Nature. I'll go through 3 functions here in more detail on the following slides. And as I mentioned before, we have teams of professional editors in-house, and they filter the submissions. They're then enhanced through the high-value editorial and production processes, and then they're amplified once the research is published. The reach of an article published in a Nature journal is something we'll cover in some detail as well later on. So there's arguably a 4th step here as well, which would be impact or lead, where post-publication we can follow the impact of the article that it has had in real life, which is what Stavroula will be talking about partly in her presentation. So to focus on filter first, so this is an infographic from 2021. So this data is from 2021. It shows the volume of submissions of manuscripts that we had at the Nature portfolio. This slide is 2019. The following ones are from 2021. The editorial teams read each and every submission that comes in, always. And their job is partly this filter step. They assess the manuscripts for originality, novelty, robustness, and many other qualities. Out of these, around 17% are sent to peer review. So that's the arrow that goes from the giant orange circle down to the red circle. So 9,873 were sent out to peer review, and that's around 17%. And then of those that are sent to peer review, around 4,505 were published eventually in one of the Nature portfolio journals. So that's about an 8% conversion rate there. But that is dependent on each journal. So some of them are higher, some of them, I don't think any of them are that much lower. And that's the filter. Moving on now to enhance. So this gives you an overview of the people. So our editors are professional editors. This is their full-time job. They have a really important role within the scientific community through conference attendance. They do networking, keeping up to date with the field, identifying new articles to attract an outreach. So they're really rooted within their research communities. Nature journals have exceptionally high production values. What that means is a significant amount of time and effort is put into each manuscript, taking special care to make sure that the text is clear, accurate, and concise so they're easier to read and convey complicated data and concepts to readers from all levels. There are some production editors, that's on the sort of top right-hand side of the screen, this sort of darker blue, I guess, color. There's 52 of those. They format the articles to make them visually appealing and easily readable. Our copy editors work on the text for clarity, and we have a team of art editors for the RJs as well as the Nature Reviews journals. I'm going to show you an example of their wonderful work on the next slide. They redraw artwork for the authors, including conceptual drawings and laying out original data. And here is an example of that. Here we go. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image that's an author submitted to one of the Nature Reviews journals, actually, in this case. And it's a very nicely organized sort of quick scribble. It's not really a scribble. I don't know how to describe it. It's actually quite good. But what happens is that's converted into the graphic that you can see on the right-hand side, which is much clearer, it has more detail, and it's a very easy way to understand a concept quite quickly. Here we go. So the third part is amplify. This slide looks at how publications in the Nature Journal are amplified. That means how they reach a wider audience than they might otherwise do. So we've got a dedicated press team. We saw that on the previous slide as well, but I didn't pull it out. And their job is to press release important articles to the media. And in 2021, they press released 468 articles, which is pretty impressive. This is talked about. So at the top of the slide, you can also see that it's about 3 million Twitter mentioned. So we monitor the alt metrics as well for all of our articles, as well as the usage and citations. That's quite a clear indicator for us that the research is being engaged with. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talking about different types of content published in our journals. So if I really broadly divide this into two types, so there's primary and there's non-primary, and we've touched upon this before, but what I really want to talk to you about is the different types of non-primary that we do have. So primary, just to define it, is original research. It can be authored by many authors, and it is who are the executors of the original research. It's always peer-reviewed, and this is the type of content that can be made away if desired. The other type is non-primary. Sorry, you can hear my dog barking maybe in the background, is non-primary. So non-primary content is defined as content that synthesizes, summarizes, or highlights data or research from one or more primary content sources, but does not itself report new data or findings. So that's a really clear distinction with this. And I'm sorry, I've been joined by my son. It's a school strike day here in the UK. Of course, today it is. So this next slide is just a layout of primary and non-primary and how its use for different readers. So you'll see that on the right-hand side, we go right to the end, we have specialist content. So that's obviously content that's created for specialists. And on the other end of that, you have those that are scientific literate. So it's more general, popular type science, sound facts and reporting. So most of our front half content sits towards specialist, but it's also, and if you look at the verticals, in depth at the top and then accessible at the bottom. So it's specialist and accessible. That is the main goal of the non-primary, not all of it, but some of the ones that I've listed here. The gold dot in the top right is where primary research would sit if we had to place it somewhere within this matrix. So it's in depth and it's specialist, of course, as you might expect. And just to pull out two non-primary types, so reviews and perspectives here. So as we mentioned, they're a synthesis of the field, or an opinion piece which provides a synthesis of the field, and they are also more specialist and in depth. Sorry for running through some of this. Here's an example of non-primary that we adapt to really, oh dear, my children are around now. This is an example of non-primary content that we adapt to help reach its specific readership that we would like it to. So here is a policy brief, for example. A policy brief is an article type that's based on an article, but it's made far more accessible for the audience that it's intended for. So a policy brief is like a 1-page, sometimes 2-page summary of the article, pulling out the main points that might be most relevant for policy influencers, for example. And here's just a summary as well of everything that I've talked about. So Nature journals advance scientific discovery by publishing robust and insightful research. Our journals filter, enhance, and amplify scientific research with our in-house professional editorial teams. Our journals are transformative journals, and we looked as well during our presentation at primary and non-primary and the difference between the two and how they're useful. And on that note, and I'm sorry about the noise, I will pass over to Stavroula.
Thank you, Jill. So following up on the key points that Jill mentioned in her last few slides, I want to talk to you about today about impact, the impact that the content we publish has. And I want to focus on impact that's quite difficult to measure. I'm talking about real world impact, as well as the impact that publishing with us can have in the careers of scientists. My journal, Nature Human Behavior, was one of the journals in the group that got involved a lot in publishing research and non-research content during the pandemic. So this is going to be a pandemic story, giving you a flavor of the types of impact the work we publish has. In the early days of the pandemic, when the pandemic was declared in March 2020, and for quite a little bit afterwards throughout 2020, there were no treatments for COVID. There was no vaccine. So essentially what we had was the only tool against the pandemic was behavior change, and how we could modify our behaviors to protect ourselves from infection. Realizing that, we very quickly commissioned a piece from 43 leading behavioral science experts across several fields of the behavioral sciences, including psychology, science communication, political science, economics, sociology, public health, and so on, and asking them to put together, to distill key scientific insights from the existing literature on a range of topics that are were key in responding to the pandemic, including science communication, leadership, threat perception, stress, and how to manage it, and more topics. Our group of scientists worked around the clock to produce the article, and we also peer-reviewed it really quickly, within 6 days, by 6 experts. So it was rigorously and thoroughly peer-reviewed by very, very quickly, and was published the month following March, when COVID was declared a pandemic. The paper has been cited more than 2,000 times. It's been accessed more than 500,000 times. It was discussed very broadly on social media, and several news stories covered it. However, the perhaps most important aspect of it was the impact it had in policy. The authors were asked to present this work at several government and non-governmental organizations, as well as other commercial entities and so on. For instance, they presented the work at the Research and Technology Subcommittee of the US House Committee on Science, Space and Technology. They also participated in a staff briefing of the US Senate Commerce Committee. Similarly, with the White House COVID-19 response team, they gave several presentations to organizations such as Ad Council, Pandemic Action Network, Twitter, and so on. And one scientist who was working in government at the time on the pandemic response highlighted how enormously influential the paper was in those early days. And in addition to the impact it had in policy thinking and policy design, the work, the piece, had a transformative impact on the scientists, on some of the scientists who participated in writing it. In the words of one of the corresponding authors, Rob Wooler of Stanford University, being engaged in this project meant that led to collaborations and advising relationships with various government actors and organizations, including the Surgeon General. And in the longer term, it led him to focus more on social impact work and on supporting other people's social impact work. I mentioned that we peer-reviewed this perspective piece on using behavioral science to respond to the pandemic within 6 days, which is record time in the behavioral and social sciences. It was unheard of at the time to have such quick peer review. But that is something that we did for all of our research and non-research content that we felt was critical to inform the policy response. More broadly, across the organization, across the Nature journals, we adopted expedited processes, and specifically at Nature Human Behavior, we committed to peer reviewing policy relevant pandemic work within 7 to 10 days, trying to get it out as quickly as possible, vetted as rigorously as possible. The paper on this slide is one example. Initially, the initial reaction across all governments to COVID, not all governments, several governments, was immediate lockdown. As soon as infections started rising, everything closed down. But the impact of complete lockdowns on well-being, on social impacts, economic impacts on the economy is huge. So the authors here used modeling and simulations to propose alternatives to complete lockdowns that allowed individuals with well-defined relationships in so-called social bubbles to interact, which meant that social distancing could be highly effective and have lower risks of infection while still having some levels of interaction. So that's where the concept of social bubbles was born, which was enormously influential in policy. With some modifications, it undergirded the support bubble policy in the UK, and it was also implemented elsewhere, including in some parts of the US, for instance, the state of Pennsylvania. So health, public health, and well-being were, of course, the first victims of the pandemic, but the economic impacts were also enormous. In this paper, which we published in the first few months of the pandemic, the authors again used mathematical modeling to estimate and project the effects of lockdowns on supply chains, and also make recommendations on how to minimize those impacts, which they were projecting to be quite substantial. The work has had substantial impact, both in China, where the lead authors came from, and worldwide. In China, the authors were contacted by the State Department, who asked for a summary of the research. The authors, of course, obliged and also translated their paper in Chinese. And in July 2020, they were contacted by the Vice Premier, Sun Chanlan, who discussed with them the proposals they'd made, the recommendations they had made in their research article, and concluded that indeed their key proposal for fast and strict supply chain management seemed to be optimal, and that's the route that the Chinese government went down through the rest of the pandemic. And indeed, in 2021 and 2020, Chinese supply chains fared quite well in comparison to pre-pandemic levels. In the US, immediately the day after publication of the paper, it was discussed during a US Congress hearing on pandemic impacts to trade. More globally, this paper led to a revision of the projections of global losses, economic losses due to COVID. Initially, the IMF had predicted that to be 3%, whereas the paper had estimated closer to 20 to 30%. The IMF and World Bank later updated the prediction to align with what the paper had shown in its modeling, and quoted this work as a reference. So the pandemic continues to evolve. We're still in the first year. Some lockdowns are still happening. Other places are not in lockdowns, but there are social distancing restrictions. Individuals really want to return to normalcy, but at the same time want to keep safe. And this is what the authors of this paper did. They built an interactive website that in real time provided users with an estimate of their risk of infection if they attended any location of their interest. This was an article that reported on a tool that eventually got extensive use during the pandemic. More than 16 million individuals used the tool, and the tool allowed both policymakers and individuals to balance risk of infection and social interaction and opening up of life in the context of the pandemic. The work ended up being funded by the CDC, and the authors are now on their second CDC contract, and they're collaborating with CDC experts on follow-up research, looking at how getting this information from the website on personalized risk assessment affects people's behavior, and how to use that in campaigns highlighting the importance of vaccine uptake. So by now it's become clear that behavioral data have played a crucial role in dealing with the pandemic at all stages. This paper, this perspective, so a non-primary research paper that we commissioned, is written collaboratively by WHO experts and working scientists, and it puts forward 10 considerations for health officials and governments to consider when transitioning from complete lockdowns to a more open life and economy. These recommendations were all based on behavioral science, and the authors told us that the paper allowed WHO Europe to unfold their recommendation to consider behavioral data in the emergency response. And it's important to note that this was the first time ever that the WHO made a clear recommendation to consider behavioral data alongside epidemiological and other data in public health crisis. Also, the insights and conclusions that the paper drew informed a series of policy forums in 2020 and 2021. These involved participants from nearly 40 countries, along with participation from partner organizations such as the European Commission, the OECD, UNICEF, and others. So we're nearing towards the end of the first year of the pandemic, where our only hope in controlling the pandemic is using non-pharmaceutical interventions. So not vaccines, not treatments, medical treatments, but still only behavior. And what this paper did was it used more than 50,000 policy decisions and NPI, so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions from more than 200 countries, and alongside several data on levels of infection and numbers of deaths to estimate the effectiveness worldwide of different interventions to contain the spread of COVID-19. The findings were striking because the authors showed that softer restrictions, which included a combination of soft measures such as scientific communication and increasing healthcare capacity, were almost as effective as complete lockdowns. So that was crucial information, and the paper had substantial impacts. The lead author, the corresponding author, Peter Klimek, gave a joint press conference with the Austrian Secretary of Health to present this paper and reflect on the lessons learned from Austria's response during the first wave, so that it could be applied in future waves. And the authors were also engaged by the Ministry of Health in Argentina and Wales, as well as the World Bank, about the findings of this paper. By now, I think most of us know that the pandemic was not just the pandemic of the COVID-19 virus, but it's also been a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. A lot of misinformation has circulated on social media from very, very early on. And we've actually had a dual pandemic. Some people argued. The virus on the one hand and viral misinformation on the other. In this paper, the authors assessed infodemics. Infodemics are epidemics of false information in the context of COVID-19. And they found that actually across worldwide, epidemic risk and infodemic risk evolved hand in hand, and the increase in each was coupled by increase in the other. The point where reliable information started to gain more traction was after the epidemic had taken hold in a certain place. This worked from the basis for setting up the COVID-19 Infodemic Observatory. This was launched by Fondazione Bruno Kessler, and it was advised by the WHO. This observatory provides almost real-time infodemic risk information worldwide, and it is also used routinely by the infodemic management team at the WHO to train infodemic managers, as well as in policymaking. One of the victims of misinformation is vaccination. So although we had very quickly, it was an incredible scientific breakthrough to have vaccines developed for COVID-19 in under a year. However, having vaccines and having people vaccinated are two different things. A lot of people are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation, and vaccine hesitancy arose as a crucial consideration, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, but it remains a problem to address. And what the authors of the paper on this slide did was they estimated how big the effect of misinformation is on accepting vaccination. They ran an experiment. They showed people either misinformation about vaccines or appropriate scientifically based information. And they found that for those people who saw the misinformation, their intention to vaccinate reduced by 6%, both in the UK and in the US. This may seem a small percentage, but actually seen in the context of the participants saw misinformation just once. In real life, we see misinformation much more frequently over extended periods of time. The fact that just seeing one bit of misinformation once already reduces your likelihood of getting vaccinated by 6% is actually quite substantial. And this work has been cited as evidence in a vast array of policy briefings and documents, including the US Surgeon General's advisory on building a healthy information environment, a briefing in the hearing of the US House Committee on Energy and Commerce on disinformation, and similar briefings and reports by the European Commission, the UK Parliamentary Office, the OECD, and more. I've touched upon impacts on the economy, health impacts on the economy, but the impacts of the pandemic has affected every aspect of life. Our authors in this paper looked at inequalities and disparities in exposure to school closures in the US. They tracked throughout the US the rate of school closures by district, and including information on socioeconomic status and other related variables. And what they found is that schools in the US did not close down uniformly across social strata. It turns out that students in more disadvantaged areas of lower socioeconomic status, who were at risk of homelessness or from belonging to ethnic minorities and racial minorities, were more exposed to closures with the associated risk of a negative impact on education. This database was used by the US Department of Education before they developed their own internal tracking mechanisms. But more importantly, the data on inequalities that the authors exposed was used to motivate expansion of school meals programs in the US, including the pandemic EBT program, where the federal government passed the program to ensure that lower income families with children still had access to resources to cover meals after the schools shut down. Scientists were also affected. They were crucial in the pandemic response, but they were also affected, and there are inequalities there as well. In this piece that we published towards the end of 2020, the authors found that women, and especially women with young children, saw significant reductions in the available time they had to devote to research because a lot of their time was now taken up by childcare and caring for other members of the family. Again, this work was picked up and cited as evidence in multiple policy briefings and reports, including reports by the US House committees, the US National Academy of Medicine, as well as the OECD. And finally, even though vaccines were rolled out, they were not rolled out equitably across the world. High-income countries, plentiful vaccines, low, middle-income countries, severe scarcities in vaccines. And this paper showed that actually, It is enlightened self-interest to distribute vaccines equitably, because without equitable distribution around the world of vaccines, new variants emerge, which means that the pandemic becomes systemic and is much more difficult to eradicate. So enlightened self-interest, work that the authors shared with the WHO and national governments, and that has formed the foundation for follow-up preparedness work for future pandemics. So this was a small tour of some of the content that Nature Human Behavior published that had tangible impacts, real-world impacts. This is true for our journals in general. The impact is not only in terms of citations, in terms of accesses, but also making differences, making a difference around the world. The science we publish is widely accessed, broadly discussed, and highly cited. It is also published in a timely manner with tangible real-world impact. So thank you very much for listening. I think we will have quite a bit of time for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much to Stavroula and Jill for your presentations. Yeah, we have a little over 10 minutes for Q&A. And before we start, we're just going to launch a quick poll there that you all can fill out. And great, so now we can move on to the Q&A. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, feel free to do so. All right, we can just go in order here. So it looks like this question came in during your presentation, Jill, from Nicole, who asks, can you clarify about what you mean by synthesis in the review journals? Do you mean evidence synthesis types such as systematic reviews, scoping reviews, etc., or are they less formal reviews of the state of a field?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So in general terms, for the Nature Reviews titles, we mean scoping reviews. So they're synthesizing there's an extensive bibliography, and the authors of these, well, I'm sure you probably know this already, but the authors of those reviews will scan through that bibliography and pull together, so synthesize sort of a summary of a specific topic within that field. We do also publish systematic reviews as well. They are not in our Nature Reviews journals, and they are actually mostly in our research journals, and there's very few of them. So most of our review content is a scoping review on the field. I hope that answers your question, but I'm happy to do any follow-up questions if not.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, another question here. I think this came in during your presentation, Stavroula. Are there any affected, maybe like differences between independent affiliated and institution/university affiliated?
We publish very little work that comes from independent researchers. So the vast majority of research we publish comes from affiliated scientists. We do have examples of people who are not in academic institutions, but who work in, for instance, non-governmental organizations that have research arms, or governmental organizations that have research arms. We do have authors. For instance, I mentioned some WHO authorship by people who are not researchers themselves, but obviously work on health-related policy.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, another question here from Robin, who asks, what kind of work do you do before deciding to launch a new journal? Do you give any consideration to following academic library budgets? And they add, at least they're following for many US libraries.
Thank you for this question, Robin. I'm really excited to answer this question because I have a really good answer for you. So yes, let's take it in two parts. So what kind of work do we do before deciding to launch a new journal? So it's a very time-intensive process, which requires us looking at the landscape. So what publications exist, as in what journals already exist, where we see growth in the market, where we might see a demand as well for publishing venue for that content. So I've sort of messed it all into one, but that usually falls into two separate things. So the landscape and the market. So just doing a deep analysis of those two things to see where there might be potential need for a new nature journal. So there might be a situation where there's high growth in a field and there's possibly a good number of publications in that field each year, but we don't think it would work or that we could do justice to a new journal in that field. So it's not necessarily just those two things. There has to be a few others as well, a few other criteria as well. But if we find that there is a need for a new nature journal, and we think we would do a really good job of publishing that content and bringing that content in, that's when we would decide to launch that journal. It's obviously a very big commitment to doing that. It takes an awful lot of work and a lot of preparation. So we don't do that lightly. That said, we have launched a lot of new launches over the last 10 years. It's been 10 years since we've been launching, and we've got 3 new launches for next January as well. Yes, we do give consideration to falling academic library budgets, absolutely. So we work very closely with editorial teams, sales teams, marketing teams, and we get feedback from sales teams about the response in the market to new journals and what the uptake is like, and just general feedback, I guess. And so that really informs us on, well, what's our strategy next? What do we need to do next? So yes, we do take that into account, and I really appreciate that question. And I also hope that has explained it, and let me know if not.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's see. We have another question. This is from Kevin, who asks, would love to know what you think about rights retention policies that Plan S funders have committed to and how you see that working with purely gold OA titles. As we don't have the money to pay the high fees for certain titles and have to rely on rights retention policies.
I can take this question actually. So the rights retention policy strategy refers to, and I may not explain it particularly clearly, but first retaining the right to put your AAM, so your author accepted manuscript, sorry, in a repository, perhaps once it's published. So whether it's subscription or anything, OA. So this is at the minute at odds with what we do because we're trying to go for a gold OA. And so this isn't fully aligned with what Springer Nature are hoping for. So I don't have much more of a response other than saying that at the minute. And I can follow up with an official statement from Springer Nature on that as well. I think what I need to just add to that is, as a publisher, Springer Nature is really fully committed to publishing OA and to making science and research as accessible as possible. And sometimes we're not potentially as quick as maybe we would like to be, but that's because there's quite a lot of complicated steps involved, perhaps that aren't as obvious as they might be. But I can follow up with that with a more in-depth statement.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question from Beth, who asks, can you say more about the transformative journals flipping to OA? What triggers the flip, target, timescale?
Oh, yeah. I think this is quite a big question, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do this justice on the Q&A now. There's a lot of different factors, a lot of different criteria. Plan S have also announced some changes at the end of 2024 that they will no longer be supporting transformative journals. So I think this is probably one that's better taken offline, and then I can spend a bit more time going into the detail with you. So I'll do that.
Sure, okay, thank you. Let's see. I think we have a question here for Stavroula. A question, my main research interests are methods and theories used in modeling and analyzing neuroscience and behavioral data, but I realize that nature methods published many genetics-related methods. Will nature human behavior be interested in these methods related research, like how to do and interpret causal inference based on human neuroimaging, behavioral data? What are the recommendations for methods researchers?
Absolutely. We would consider such work. Nature methods would also consider such work. The easiest way to get a sense as to whether the paper is a candidate for publication is actually to submit it, because we try very hard to be very quick in giving you a first response within 7 days to let you know whether it's a good fit for the journal or whether it might be a better fit elsewhere. If it's a good fit for the journal, we would send it out for review. We have an article format, the resource format. Some types of papers in the methods fields in neuroscience and psychology are probably suitable as resources. But if you have a specific project in mind, you're very welcome to contact me via email. My email address is on our website. I'll be very happy to respond.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, another question here for you, Jill, from Deborah. Would you be able to share titles/subject areas of the upcoming new Nature publications?
I can. So what's really exciting is that a press announcement went out this morning about the 2024 new launches. So your question is really well timed. So you may have already seen it, but if you haven't, the 3 new titles for 2024 will be Nature Chemical Engineering, Nature Reviews Electrical Engineering, and Nature Cities. So there's quite a strong applied focus for these 3 journals, or engineering focus, certainly. Nature Cities has such a broad scope with, I wouldn't say anything related to cities, but it's a thematic journal which will cover a lot of potentially civil engineering, but also environmental side. So I would be happy to share the link to those 3 new journals after this webinar is finished. And then we usually decide or complete our work on the following year's new launches. So for 2025, that's not complete yet, so I wouldn't be able to let you know because I don't know yet, and that gets finished usually middle of the year. So we may know more towards the end of this year, but unfortunately I can only tell you 2024 new launches at the moment.
Okay, got it. Let's see, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more. There's a question here from Gwen, who says, I'm preparing a presentation for faculty about predatory journals, and I'd like to be able to share the Nature suite of journals as my example of non-predatory journals. Can you point me to where on your website or share data about the journal's publication requirements and fees, as well as impact factor data? Maybe a place to find that, or...
Yep, so you can find that on each of the journals. So each of the journals has their own website, and there is a tab along the top that you can have a drop-down menu, and I can't remember what it's under. I think it's publishing options. So that will tell you about the different business models and the publication requirements and fees. And then there's another option under there, but I can't remember what the drop-down title would be. Sorry, that would also have some of the bibliometrics, I guess. So the impact factor data will be there as well. I'm more than happy to help. So feel free to send me an email as well if there's anything that you can't find that you would like to see, and maybe we can help you with that as well.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it looks like we're right at the end here. So I'll just note that anyone whose question wasn't answered, we do have a transcript of all the questions, and I think our presenters will be very happy to follow up with any outstanding questions. Okay, so I'll just say thank you so much to Jill and Stavroula for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the archive version. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, Sabrina.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Have a
Thanks.
lovely rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.